So it is my pleasure to introduce our first speaker, and it's only fitting that he hails from Harvard University, which is the nation's oldest institution of higher learning. He also lives just a stone's throw away from the Boston Tea Party. David Edwards holds several patents for creating innovative ways to deliver vaccines through aerosol technology instead of needles. And he spends time in Africa helping to fight the spread of infectious diseases with this novel approach. David also heads up the Idea Translation Lab at Harvard. And for those of us that work in the Center for Applied Technology, the notion of translating ideas into reality is very provocative. And what you'll see today with David's talk and a lot of the brilliant students and brilliant inventions that you'll see throughout the afternoon is that they have a unique way of combining art, science, and experiential learning that is truly leading to brilliant outcomes. So thank you all very much for being here. We're looking forward to a fantastic show. Please join me in welcoming David Edwards.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you very, very much. Thank you very much. I'm really delighted to be here, and it's very moving to see the history that we all sort of assume when we stand here on the stage. So actually, I've been exploring for the last several years novel ways that we can develop ideas very collaboratively to broad and sort of surprising impact, and have been creating a network of organizations here in the Boston area and also internationally, and particularly in Paris, many of which are connected to Harvard where I teach. All of which have some commonality in that they merge in different ways what we conventionally think of as art and what we conventionally think of as science. Now, in terms of what we do exactly, I think it's helpful to think about what we all do pretty much every day of our lives when we develop ideas. So I like to think of idea development in terms of idea translation. So I imagine that I'm in a room like this room where every molecule around me is an idea. And if I'm the set of ideas of impact measure 0, which is all these ideas are sort of inside of me, as I move these ideas out from me, or I translate them, I move them to greater impact. Now, impact is all relative, and there may be one corner of the room which is commercial, and one corner of the room which is cultural, and one corner of the room which is educational, one corner of the room which is social, humanitarian, and I may start out with an idea that's aiming at the commercial corner, and I translate it, but through the experimental process that is idea translation, it may end up moving to a cultural corner, and I'm really interested in organizations that allow that to happen. Now, let me just take a couple really concrete ideas to make it sort of real for all of us. We have really simple ideas, like I wake up in the morning and I have this urge for a glass of milk. And so there's this kind of physical need, maybe a social need of milk. And I don't really know, I don't have the glass of milk, and so it's very hypothetical that I'm going to satisfy this need. But I make a hypothesis, and the hypothesis is that my wife has bought milk, and it's in the refrigerator. And so I make this hypothesis, I test my hypothesis. So I get out of bed, and I go to the refrigerator, open the door, and there's no milk. And so I have done a few things that are sort of fundamental to life. Number one, I dreamed about satisfying this need. It happened to be very personal. I made a hypothesis. I tested my hypothesis, and then I opened it, and I learned something. And it turns out I learned I was wrong, but I learned something really important. And that's how we develop ideas. Now, it could be that I woke up in the morning and I wanted to become president of the United States. And actually, it's a very similar process, even more hypothetical, but it's a similar process by which we develop ideas every day of our lives. The reality is that ideas, even as simple as the idea of satisfying my need for milk, tend to involve iteration. And so we find ourselves very frequently in front of these refrigerator doors, and we're wrong. And those of us who are not sort of passionately wedded to having that glass of milk give it up. And we say, well, we really don't want it. The reality is that most of the ideas that really matter and for which we sort of receive a salary, perhaps, or that remain in our minds late in life involve this very complicated idea translation where very frequently we're in front of this refrigerator door. And there's a lot of things that happen in front of that door, depending on how complex the idea is. And they include frustration. They could be humiliation. It could be a loss of confidence, and finally, again, we often give up the idea. Now, one of the most incredible things that I find is that there's a group of people, maybe most of you actually, who love these moments, which is sort of really weird. And we think, for example, I hear often that Wolfgang Mozart was a very unhappy man, young man, and that's probably true, but my guess is that he loved being that unhappy man. In other words, there was this sort of serial entrepreneur, composer, writer in Wolfgang Mozart that loved having this blank sheet of paper and really not knowing what to put on it. And he was probably unhappy and frustrated and not very kind, even to the people he loved. But he wanted to be there. And why? And why do creative people like to be in front of that blank page? Well, there's a lot of things that happen in front of that blank page. Number one, we're very curious. We listen very, very carefully. Everything sort of matters to us. We're sort of the adolescent wondering, what am I going to be when I grow up? And so we learn. In fact, we're most capable of learning in those moments. Those are the key moments of an idea translation. Now, what happens with you've a little bit of experience, and perhaps one of the greatest gifts I think to be able to give to a young person is the experience of being in front of that refrigerator door and knowing that finally you're going to get the milk. Once you've gone through it, you want often to come back to it because the thrill of actually figuring it out sort of confirms something very fundamental about what it is to be alive. Now, what I am fascinated in is how does that happen? And my observation is that there's a couple processes that fuse, and it's worth talking about because these processes, I think, are separated increasingly in our institutions because of specialization. And so one of these processes is what we conventionally think of as art, or as method, at least in process, is the aesthetic method. It's image-driven, it is comfortable with its uncertainty, it sort of thrives in ambiguity, it's intuitive, it's inductive, and it's sort of the substance of hypothesis. And then there's its other process, which is analytical and deductive and capable of simplifying a complex problem to some conditions that can then be resolved, sort of what we think of this as the scientific method, or science as process. And so these processes of art and science fuse in the minds of all of us and creators generally in these critical moments where this hypothesis happens. How do I know that the milk is not here? Well, I bet that I can get milk. I mean, in fact, of course, I've got some experience behind it, but it's not a totally deductive process. And as you think about complex ideas, often hypotheses are very sort of mystical. And one of the people I was always very impressed by is Judah Folkman. And how did he pursue this idea of angiogenesis, which in many ways he didn't really have the data for years and years and years, and yet he pursued it. What was going on exactly? So it's a very hypothetical process that goes on. But this is also this analytical process of kind of formulating the next step and getting on with it. So this is what I think of as art science. And by the way, it's all over, and it's been all over forever. Of course, you see it in some kinds of environments like a chef's cuisine. Clearly, there's this sort of creator's invisible hand that gets everybody to work together, even though they're not all kind of looking to make money necessarily, but there's a sort of invisible hand that's making them all work together towards this broader goal. I see it with my little boys, 6, 8, and 10 years of age. They watch Indiana Jones, and after the film, within minutes, they're reenacting some scene, which is fascinating to me in that there's really no director. They all kind of figure out what role they're going to play, and suddenly they're creating this thing that their parents applaud, which happens through this sort of creator's invisible. So it's a fascinating thing. We've all seen it. Now, what's interesting to me is that this is nevertheless being driven out of our institutions, and it's understandable. I teach at Harvard University. It's a very specialized university, and I would guess that Fidelity is also a very specialized kind of institution. And really, there's no way to react to this explosive information growth that we're experiencing right now, and will probably forever be experiencing right now, without specializing, without creating knowledge domains that we specialize in and therefore absorb and learn how to transmit to the next generation. And so it's a normal thing. However, in the process of doing that, what's happening is we're creating families and departments and institutions where we applaud and we reward the aesthetic method, the hypothesis, or we applaud and reward and encourage the analytical method. But not very frequently do we find environments where both are understood and encouraged. And so what's happening is that innovators, creators are leaving institutions and do leave institutions. And it's not because they're saying, I'm sort of protesting the institution. It's because they have ideas, and they can't really develop the ideas in the institution. And an illustration, this sort of personal, is related to inhaled chocolate. Now, it's sort of weird that a professor of biomedical engineering would think about inhaling chocolate, but it was something that came up a couple years ago, and I shared it with some students, and we all developed it. And then, however, there was really no way I could have a student sort of doing a thesis in inhalable food, or really talk very much to my colleagues about it. Not that. And that's right. It just really didn't belong there. And so what happened was that at the end of the day, I left and did lots of really weird things that ultimately led to the whiff inhaled chocolate coming out commercially. And so that's what's happening, and that's what people do all the time. Now, what has fascinated me, and now to get to the real heart of my talk, is the idea of, in these specialized times, is it possible to create a kind of network of labs where we encourage this and we support this sort of fundamental creative process that's very hard to institutionalize, and partner with institutions to help catalyze innovation. And so I think of it, for the purpose of this talk, as something like the culture lab or sort of art science lab, where a lot of the structures sort of look like the contemporary translational science lab, and that we have not-for-profits and for-profits and all kinds of special structures that make them communicate. But it has one interesting outcome, in that the outcomes of idea translation may not only be industrial, but could be purely cultural or educational or social. And it is helpful to think about this as an idea funnel, and at the top of the funnel we have ideas that are coming into this funnel, and they're coming in as sort of breakthrough kinds of ideas, very blue sky sorts of ideas, often seeded by very innovative artists and designers and entrepreneurs that are being seeded amongst young people, high school and university students, as seeds of experiential learning. And those students then make them their own. And you'll hear from some students later on who've done that. And as they develop, and so that's educational value, and Harvard University invests in that for the education. As these ideas develop, they may develop to such maturity that they're exposed in exhibit mode internationally, and translated further as with cultural value, and then ultimately realized in the form of not-for-profits and for-profits and products and exhibitions. We've developed a set of organizations. There is at this top of the funnel, what I think of as the Idea Translation Labs. The first was created at Harvard University, and now there's one that's just been created at the Cloud Foundation, which is a charitable foundation here in Boston that I created with my wife. There's at the center of the funnel, what we think of as the labs. The first lab, the Laboratoire, was created in Paris a couple years ago, and now we're opening the lab at Harvard later in this fall. The university is opening it. And we have then a number of startups and not-for-profits and things that have come out, and we've created some structures to help make that happen. So having just talked broadly, I'd like to talk now just about what we do really quickly. So we do art projects, so some very broad things. The most visible part of this structure is in Paris, in the center of Paris near the Louvre. There's this exhibition space called the Laboratoire. The first experiment we did, so we do art and science experiments. These are artists and designers who are dreaming, and we push them to dream at frontiers of science. With the idea that we're going to catalyze innovation in some space. So the first experiment happened with Fabrice Hibert, who's a French artist who worked with my former advisor at MIT, Bob Langer, to come up with a contemporary art exhibition that gave the public the experience of being a stem cell becoming a neuron. So that after those months of incomprehension, we went on to the next exhibition. We did a project with Ryoji Ikeda, who's a Japanese composer, who sort of the leading digital composer in Japan, who did a project with Dick Gross at Harvard University, who's a world-leading number theorist, on the concept of infinity and made a kind of soundless composition. So the very, very abstract projects. The WIF came out of the laboratoire, and we also did a project where I collaborated with Mathieu Lahaneur, who's a French designer on an object. The original idea was to make plants smarter, and it became a filter that I'll talk about here in a little bit. We do a lot with food. One of the big challenges we have is how do you get the public, all of us, to understand innovation or art more as process than outcome? So that's a big challenge at the university or in museums, is we tend to show discovery and innovation and art and so forth as outcomes, when in fact it's all about process, and that's what you see in a lab. But it's hard to get people to enter in a lab and to understand that. And so food happens to be a way to do that. And so we do a lot with food. We do a lot with humanitarian projects. I'm very involved with global health projects, so we do a lot around global health and with a not-for-profit Medicine in Need, which is based in Africa and also in Paris and here in Cambridge. So really briefly, what comes out, we catalyze innovation commercially. So we have products that have come out. You'll hear a little bit more about that later, including Andrea, which is coming out with Frontgate and Hammaker Schlemmer here this fall. We have a site where we give the public the interaction with what doesn't work. We do experiments that catalyze cultural innovation, and so you hear a little bit later about MuseTrek, which is a big collaboration we're developing with the Louvre and the Centre Pompidou and other museums. But it started as kids, young Harvard kids and now Boston high school kids. We have exhibits that have gone to these different places. We are also, and I'll finish here with education, we're fundamentally interested in how we learn. Big challenge today in how we teach, really, in an age where information is sort of very widely accessible. And so the idea of a university as an information provider is sort of challenged. And so if we think back about how we learned as a kid, you may not remember, but you were in a crib at one point, and then you went to a living room, and then you went to your first class. And those big changes of culture were very stimulating. You were very, very aware of your environment. And that's kind of how we learned. And the thing about specialization is you end up becoming so deep in your hole that you actually never go out of your crib. And so you sort of cease to learn in a certain way. And so what we try and do with young high school kids now and university kids at Harvard is to, before they specialize too much, let them know that their ability to move out of the crib will be fundamental to their ability to be creative throughout their lives, even as they specialize. And so we seed ideas amongst students. You'll hear of some of those, and then they make them their own, and they go on and learn. We have Harvard University money that sends these kids around the world to develop these ideas. And now finally, we've brought this to Boston in something called the Art Science Prize that you hear more about, which was announced with it's a big partnership with the Boston Public Schools, and in a way a bet on the ability of high school students here in Boston to change the world. And so we are counting on help from the creator's invisible hand. In other words, if my kids can act out Indiana Jones, anything is possible. So thank you very much. Really delighted to be here. Thank you.